As I begin this lecture, let me tell you that there is a document file that goes along with the PowerPoint presentation that you'll be seeing on screen. And so you can consult that along with the video that follows. My topic for this lecture is Introduction to Old Testament Criticism, the scope, the divisions, and the controversies. First of all, a definition of what is biblical criticism. Now, biblical criticism does not necessarily mean criticizing the Bible in the sense of finding fault with it. Though, to tell you the truth, there are some, which some call the critical view, that does in fact find fault with the Bible. It'll tend to be this critical view, as it's sometimes called, will tend to be very anti-supernatural. We'll see the Bible as full of errors. But we evangelicals also practice biblical criticism, and evangelicals and theological conservatives will practice biblical criticism without necessarily finding fault with the Bible. The word criticism, in the expression Old Testament criticism or biblical criticism, comes from a Greek expression, he kritike techne, the discriminatory art, and it refers to a broad array of techniques employed in the study of written documents. Criticism asks certain questions of the text. Who wrote it? When was it written? To whom was it written? And questions of that nature. Biblical criticism can be divided into two broad categories: lower criticism and higher criticism. Lower criticism is kind of an old-fashioned term for what is more commonly called textual criticism today. Textual criticism seeks to establish the original text of a document whose originals no longer exist and whose copy vary in their readings. And so when we come to the Bible and we find ancient manuscripts and they don't all agree, or the ancient versions don't agree with the Masoretic text, as we'll talk about later, well, if we ask the question, well, which reading is the correct reading? Well, then we are doing lower criticism or textual criticism. Higher criticism includes all other matters of biblical analysis that is outside of textual criticism. So when you ask the question of when was a work written, what are the historical and geographical circumstances behind the writing of this text, the sources used by the author of this text, the purpose of writing the text, the organization of the writing of the text, the style and the genres and the ideology of each biblical book, and the question of when and how the book came to be recognized as canonical. But when we ask those kinds of questions, well, then we are engaged in higher criticism. Now, higher criticism has a number of techniques that we will discuss in a later lecture. Source criticism, having to do with documents used by an author in compiling and writing his document. A historical criticism that places the writing in its historical context. Form criticism, which emphasizes literary genres and how they were passed down over time. Redaction criticism of how authors may have edited earlier texts that existed. Rhetorical criticism, or the literary approach, which looks at the final form of the text and asks the question of why an author might have portrayed or written the text in the way that he or she did. And there's many other questions: philology, the study of words; archaeology; sociological analysis. Those are all higher critical techniques. Now, another term for what we're talking about in this course is biblical introduction, or for our class, Old Testament introduction. Biblical introduction deals with subjects preliminary to the study and interpretation of the contents of the Bible. Matters of introduction are meant to aid us in understanding the Bible, or some portion thereof, and its message. So a course in Old Testament criticism could also be called a course in Old Testament introduction. That term introduction is used as a technical term for what we could also call Old Testament criticism. Again, the kinds of questions that biblical criticism is going to ask centers around such things as authorship, who wrote the text; the date of the text; or the historical circumstances of the writer when he wrote the text; his story, which might be conveying things in the past as compared with the author's time; and the audience to whom he is delivering the message. It'll ask the question of what's the original text. That's our textual criticism issue. The history of the transmission of the text. How was it handed down to us that we receive the text as we see it now in the Bible? And literary genres, or types of writings within the text. That's also questions that come up in biblical critical analysis. There are two types of, or shall we say, two divisions of introductory type material. One part is sometimes called general introduction. These are things that might apply to the whole Bible, or in our case, to all the Old Testament, or, of course, in New Testament criticism, to all the New Testament. So there are certain things like transmission of the text that might not just apply to one part of the Bible, but the Bible as a whole. But then there is special introduction that has to do with particular books of the Bible, or particular genres within the biblical writings. Some issues related to general introduction has to do with texts and versions of the Bible. Again, how the text was transmitted to us, and we received it, and much of that is true for the whole Bible, not just the whole Old Testament, not just one portion of it. The canon is another question that to some degree applies to the whole Bible, or at least major portions of it. So how was it that the books that are in the Old Testament came to be in our Bible? And why were some books excluded from our Bible that might have been in the canon? Archaeology in the Bible is not limited to a particular genre, although we will treat that under the historical part of the Old Testament. And even the history of biblical criticism, the history of how people have gone about doing biblical criticism, is a part of biblical criticism. We can talk about the methodologies of the historical critical approach and the like. We could talk about applications of it and things like the Graf-Wellhausen documentary hypothesis. And if you were to look at the New Testament, things like the synoptic problem and historicity of the Gospels would be matters of general introduction. Now, the way that we will approach the text is going to be different than the way certain other biblical scholars approach the text. We are approaching the text with evangelical presuppositions. We believe that the Bible is the Word of God. We assume that the Bible is reliable. We might even be willing to use the word inerrant. We believe that the Bible is worthy of our trust and should be read through the eyes of faith. Now, others, you might call them liberal scholars, or some people call this the critical view, but it's another term for liberal scholarship. The critical view will tend to look at the Bible as merely a human book. Now, the Bible is, of course, a human book, but it's not just a human book. There's a supernatural element to it. Those that hold to the critical view will often see errors in the Bible and find contradictions in the Bible. And those that do biblical criticism from the assumptions of the critical view will subject the Bible to radical skepticism. You might say the evangelical assumption is that the Bible is innocent until proven guilty, where there's questions about it, whereas the critical view would tend to take the opposite view, that the Bible is guilty until proven innocent. Well, part of our purpose in this class is to seek to demonstrate that one can analyze the Bible with intellectual integrity and yet not reach some of the negative conclusions of radical criticism. That we don't have to assume that the patriarchs didn't exist, or that there was no Exodus, or that the book of Joshua is fictional. And so evangelical biblical criticism can be used to show how belief in the Bible's reliability is not incompatible with scholarly and technical study of the Bible. And we will try to show how the conclusion of certain rationalist biblical critics are not the necessary ones. This ends our introduction to biblical criticism.